Hi, welcome to Talking Books and Stuff, the program that talks all about books and writing and stuff. Here's your host, Dennis Rimmer.
Hello and welcome back. This is Talking Books and Writing and Stuff. DR here, and with us today we have from the West Coast, from the San Francisco area, Joel Selvin, author of Hollywood Eden, Electric Guitars, Fast Cars, and the Myth of the California Paradise. Joel Selvin, thank you very much for being with us today here.
Great to be here.
And you graduated, or supposedly, high school in 1967. So did I. How did you avoid staying out of the Army for that period down there in the U.S.?
What a question. Let's. Also, I want to correct you. I didn't quite graduate. I just sort of stopped going.
It says here you failed to graduate.
As far as the whole draft thing goes. How do I want to say this? They recognized in their evaluations that I wouldn't be a fit soldier.
Perfect. Well, there's always deferments you can get if you keep going to school or something like that, and or join the reserves. I don't know. Up here in Canada, I grew up on the West Coast, Vancouver, BC suburbs, and 10 miles away from the U.S. and guys in Blaine, Washington, my age, are off to Vietnam getting shot up, and guys my age, 10 miles north of Blaine, are sitting around drinking beer, smoking dope, and going to school. So it's a completely different background for the both of us, apparently.
I was unaware there was a draft in Canada.
No, there wasn't. That's a thing. We didn't have to do anything.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't think so, because, that was one of the strategies, was to go to Canada.
Well, apparently the trick was that border people would get you to recite the alphabet. And if you said Z at the end, then you were trapped.
Yeah, well, I went to school in England. I know Zed.
Ah, good. So Hollywood Eden, I saw a review in our local newspaper, and my jaw dropped. I said, I got to talk to this guy, because 57 to 63 is my favorite kind of music, and the surf songs and all that stuff. And I said, I got to talk to this guy. Contacted the publicist from House of Annecy, I don't know how to pronounce it, and bang, the book arrived on my doorstep. I haven't put it down since. So how did you come up with the idea to do this segment of musical history?
Well, I think the whole thing sort of gelled or ignited when one of my goofy buddies showed me a yearbook from University High School, and I realized that all these people went to high school together and knew each other together. High school is such a quintessential American experience that I don't know that it has its parallel elsewhere. It certainly doesn't in England. But there's a socializing process and a politicizing and a sexualizing process that goes on that's much more important in many ways than the educational part of the whole deal. And the fact is, people in high school, you kind of know the rest of your life, whether you're in touch with them or not. I don't know how that works, but so when I realized that all these people went to high school together, I saw the nucleus, the collection of this thing as a real starting point for something, and I saw it right through from the football players singing in the showers after practice to Brian Wilson making Good Vibrations.
And all these people, we're talking Nancy Sinatra, we're talking Dean Torrance, Kim Fowley, sort of the bad boy of rock and roll. All these people, Arnie Ginsberg from Jan and Arnie, Gas Money. And how many others did I miss there? Even the original Gidget, yes.
Gidget, yeah, the real Gidget. Ryan O'Neal was in that class, the actor, so was James Brolin. They were Patrick O'Neill, and James Bruderlin back then. And Bruderlin was, one of Jan's pals. He was in the Barons, and he hung out at the garage with everybody. I just don't think he was much of a singer. And so there was this just incredible collection of people gathered together in this little tiny place, right? 700 people at school together in the rock and roll years of 55 to 58. So it was a real sort of petri dish of believe me, white privileged people who's grew up in Brentwood and Bel Air neighborhoods, very well off and very heavily influenced by show business. I mean, Frank Sinatra sent his daughter there.
Right, and they're all born like in the early 40s, I guess, the war years for a lot of us in North America, not me, but these guys. And so by the time they're in high school, 15, 16, 17, like you said, they've got everything, fast cars, electric guitars, and the show business thing. So, yeah, it's like the 700 people. It's like a small town. Everybody knows each other. And I didn't even know there was that many other people on the outside that were that aren't mentioned in your book. So it must have just been an amazing American graffiti come to life kind of thing.
Yeah, that's what it is. Excuse me. Yeah, you're right. It is that culture that Lucas dreamed up in his mind, that he imagined from his own youth in what, Modesto or Visalia, wherever he was, the Central Valley.
Yep.
But you got to see that, like the west side of Los Angeles, sitting there on the hill above the beach was just an incredibly special time and place in Los Angeles before freeway and before smog.
Right. And it's California. Everybody thinks of California as actually just being Los Angeles. So is there a dividing line kind of between Northern California and Southern California?
There's certainly different cultures. And we're talking about George Lucas being in Central Valley. Yet another culture is heard from. But I'll tell you, I found a distinct parallel between the surfers on the south coast of the 50s and the beatniks in San Francisco at the same time. The surfers were more athletic and outdoors, but the ethos was awfully similar. They were anti-conformists, nonconformists. They were anti-convention. They saw themselves as outsiders from mainstream society, and they had adopted their own set of values and cultural signatures and even vocabulary and wardrobe, So I found a lot of parallels between those two, and they share a lot of the values, even if they're only in sort of rejecting, what you reject. It makes you gives you common ground. So that's like how the different cultures take place. Yet California itself, in the 1950s, was so remote from the rest of the country. I mean, this was before jet travel. So it was like a 3-day train ride from New York to get to Los Angeles or San Francisco. And you have to traverse the whole of the continental United States. So California was out there on its own as a kind of new world within the new world. And I remember a 1960s television advertisement when they were just first pumping up jet travel. And it was American Airlines, and they had this newsman, Chet Huntley, who was a big deal on network TV, standing on a beach in California. He said, "California, if Columbus had landed here, would we have moved east?"
And Chet and David and Chet. Good night, David. Good night, Chet. Joel Selvin is with us. The book is Hollywood Eden, Electric Guitars, Fast Cars, and the Myth of the California Paradise. Now, like you say, you start the book with the guys singing in the shower after football practice. Now, how did you know that? How did you find out this stuff?
Oh, this is not unknown territory at all. In many regards, there's been many, many writers and researchers here ahead of me, and some people who have done far more detailed research than I would ever have the time or patience for. So a lot of this is bibliographically obtained. But then, my own research fills in the cracks and goes around the corners. I'm literally standing on the shoulders of a bunch of people who have been before me and compiled all this information. And so I'm in a position to look over and see what's missing and cherry pick that. Also, I have a specific sort of pursuit, right? Like a lot of the earlier researchers were more discographical in nature, record collectors types, and they want to compile that kind of information. And while that's very interesting and certainly relevant, what I was trying to do with Hollywood Eden was concoct a narrative that portrayed what it was like to actually be these people. So I could glean from what I could glean from the existing research, and then go after the things that I found missing, those kind of humanizing details, the content of relationships, the impact of feelings and emotions, and also the crucial details that might not seem so important to other people, but to me, those are the things that serve to make the story come to life and give it that resonance of veracity.
And we're talking with Joel Selvin about Hollywood Eden. Just came out. Go get it tomorrow and read it and pass it on to your friends. Let's start with some of the characters. Jan and Dean, of course, take prominence in the book. Jan Barry especially was a guy. How did he manage to go to university and music business, get into medical school, all the same time not necessarily going to school all that much? He must have been a genius, this guy.
Well, he's certainly a remarkable personality and high-powered in ways that very few people are. Jill Gibson, who lived with him for many years, tells me that he didn't actually sleep much. So he packed a lot into his life as it was going on, and I'm sure he was having an incredibly great time for a good portion of it. Being in a fraternity, going to college, headed for medical school, all that while your records are on the charts and you have this blossoming career and you spend weekends doing gigs with your buddy. It sounds pretty fun. And that's really what it was all about. I mean, nobody launched careers in rock and roll. You weren't expected to have careers. Nobody did. You were expected to have a record or two maybe, but nothing after that. It was the Beach Boys that were really the first American rock group to have a career per se.
No, yep, carry on.
Yeah, go on.
Yep, and Jan and Dean were talking. I was listening to Dead Man's Curve just the other day with completely different perspective, and you're right, the sound, that's a wall of sound production behind that one, and the orchestration and the narration, and is boom, 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 Sandy Nelson playing on that record?
No, that's Hal Blaine and Earl Palmer, which was the signature of a Jan and Dean session, was to have the two best drummers in Los Angeles playing in unison. Quite a wallop on there, yeah. Probably Leon Russell on piano. Could be Glenn Campbell on guitar. Certainly Tommy Tedesco's in there on guitar. Customarily it'd be 3 or 4 guitar players, a couple piano players, maybe even 2 bass players, one on electric bass and one on stand-up bass. These boots are made for walking, has that double bass combination. So does Good Vibrations. I mean, Carol Kay wants you to think she played those parts all by herself, but no. Lyle Ritz had a Dan Electro behind her.
That's why I saw that move, the Wrecking Crew documentary, so she's prominent in that. Dead Man's Curve sort of foretold what was going to happen, unfortunately, to Jan Barry later on when he had that terrible crash and accident. So it's a sad
Dead
story.
Man's Curve, like all these records, came out of the lives they lived. Mm-hmm. That was how this whole California myth got perpetrated. And, it starts really with Gidget and the Gidget movie. And the Gidget movie, while not nonfiction, was really drawn from the life of Kathy Koner. And that was the first sense of what life was like for teenagers in growing up on the west side of Los Angeles, and it really captured America's attention. And when that's followed by these records that start to paint the picture of their common life, whether it's Beach Boys singing about surfing, or In My Room, or Jan and Dean singing about cars, and indeed Dead Man's Curve was taken from their real life. Jan frequently drag raced people miles down Sunset Boulevard through traffic at very reckless high speeds. It was a part of his life even before he had a driver's license.
I was racing down Doheny late one night when an XKE pulled up on the right, so you can't get any better than that.
The XKE belonged to the Roger Christian, who was a disc jockey and one of their lyric writers, and the Stingray. Jan was a Stingray man, so he even drew the cars from the song from his things. And that song also was started by Brian Wilson, and Brian's all over that record, singing and playing. They had such a fluid, creative collaboration, and it was Brian was practically a part of Jan and Dean.
Well, we'll get to that in a moment, because there's so many other topics to hit upon here with Hollywood Eden by Joel Selvin right here on Talking Books. Dead Man's Curve. Phil Spector, was he really a jerk as much as people say he was? Or is?
Yeah, but he was a jerk that knew what he was doing. So, that puts him in a different category than ordinary jerks. He was a pain in the ass and obnoxious and pushy, but there was something in him that was driven and saw around the corner. From the point of where he starts in the record business as a high school senior to when he makes the I Cantina record at the end of the book, he was an extraordinarily vital artistic force in the record industry. And although the public thought they were records by the Crystals and the Ronettes and the Righteous Brothers, they were actually Phil Spector records.
And I heard a story once that said, a guy told me when I was working in radio in the 70s, that Phil Spector used to, I don't know if it's true, mix his records through a transistor radio speaker just to hear what it would sound like on the radio. Do you know anything about that?
Oh, that's pretty common. They had a jukebox in the Motown studios. They used to play their mixes back through jukeboxes. And I have never been in a studio that didn't have a sort of car radio set up that you could play back through. It's like, let's hear this on some crap. Okay, how about this? Click. So, yeah, transistor radio makes a lot of sense. You want to really see what the world's going to hear this as in real life.
Exactly. So instead of just the big studio speakers and all the fancy equipment, River Deep Mountain High, such a powerful record, and yet it kind of brought an end to Phil Spector's career. It was a big hit in England, apparently, but nothing over here in North America, and that just kind of must have shattered him completely, because I still think it's just a great production.
Oh, it's a masterpiece. It's the culmination of what he and arranger Jack Nietzsche have been working on for years. And in many ways, it wasn't just the rejection of the record by radio and the public in America. He was out of avenues to explore. He'd done what he could do. And anything beyond that was going to just be an echo of stuff he'd already done. So, that's kind of demotivating to an artist, and I'm not sure how completely Spector knew that, but there's quite a bit of sense that he did understand that he'd kind of exhausted his vision.
It's like hockey players or somebody, when they know they're at the end of the line, they can't do what they used to do, even though what they do now is 10 times better than anybody else anyway. But in their mind, they're not as good as they once were, and so that's it. They just kind of hang them up, as they say. Or was it more of a mental shock to Phil Spector to know that he just couldn't progress past this point?
I know I'm in Canada when I'm starting to get hockey analogies. Neil Young told me that in hockey, guys think about hockey, beer, and girls in that order. Mm-hmm. You think that's true?
Pretty much. I play in an over 60 league, and you can imagine how many guys are over 60. I wrote a story for a local newspaper. I'm the second worst hockey player in the world because I got to figure there's got to be somebody out there worse than I am. But
well, go, man! That's fantastic.
Well, it's one of the few sports, just a sideline here, that you can play all your life. I can't see any 70-year-old football players out there banging heads, or soccer players. You can play basketball maybe, pickleball, curling, but hockey you can keep on going till you drop. And some of the guys have. They're in their 80s, and they're still playing. In fact, we have a Hall of Fame for guys over 80. So,
it's never occurred to me, but then, I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it.
Well, you know,
I'm here in the lower 48,
Maybe you shouldn't think about it. But I digress. Phil Spector we've talked about. Jan and Dean slightly. Whatever happened to Arnie Ginsberg? He just kind of dropped out of sight after...
Oh, no, he went on to school and had a very successful career as an architect and, looked upon the 6 months he spent with Jan and Barry as Jan and Arnie as some kind of fluky moment in his teenage years, and altogether reasonable approach to life. And in 1958, rock and roll was not here to stay. Rock and roll was suspect as like this evanescent trial balloon. Who knows? Right. The next year when Harry Belafonte was all real popular, they thought Calypso would be the next big thing, and rock and roll would be yesterday's paper.
Exactly.
But here we are all these years later,
That's right. And there was a disc jockey called Arnie Woo Woo Ginsberg, but that wasn't the same guy, huh?
No, and he's East Coast anyway, that one.
That's right. Dick Dale, the surf guitar. He was kind of a bit older than these guys?
A little bit. 4 or 5 years. He'd been had a couple of sort of runs at music business and was kind of an Elvis-y singer, guitar player when he tumbled to this audience across the street from the beach in Huntington Beach, and those kids were coming to the dances barefoot. They were just walking across the beach till they pay their 50 cents or whatever to get in at the dance, and this is an example of culture creating itself, right? Because that's the beginnings of this whole surf culture, and these kids would spend all day surfing, and then they'd go to the Dick Dale dance, and Dick began to adapt his act to this very, very quickly, the kind of music they wanted and what, how it worked. Plus, of course, at the same time, that's when Leo Fender found Dick. And Dick became like a pilot program for Leo Fender's laboratory experiments. And Dick was playing the very first Fender Stratocaster, and he was playing the very first Fender Showman amplifier. No, those were prototypes that Leo had made in the factory, and Dick was brought in to sort of try out. So there's a real convergence of culture and stuff just beginning to be born all there, right?
Yeah, and Dick Dale, let's go tripping. Beach Boys, can't escape any talk of 57 to 63 without the Beach Boys. And we got Brian Wilson, of course, domineered by his father, the other two brothers, the cousin, the friends, and Bruce Johnson, I didn't know played such a prominent role in everything dating back to even when he was in high school he went to the same school, right?
Well, he ran with the University High Crowd. He lived 2 block and a half down the hill from Jan. Jan's father was Howard Hughes's right-hand man, and they lived in a sumptuous place on the absolute peak of the Bel Air Hills. And Bruce's father was the head of the Rexall drug chain, which was a nationwide pharmacy company.
Right.
And they lived next door to Burt Lancaster, right in the neighborhood.
Oh,
so Bruce and Jan used to take the bus to school together, and he's a couple years younger.
Right.
But he was playing piano on those sessions in the garage, and that's where he met Sandy Nelson, and he was playing on Sandy Nelson's 1959 hit Teen Beat, and he was playing on records before that with Sandy, with Kip Tyler and the Flips. This is one of Los Angeles' first rock and roll bands. Bruce has always been a part of it. I mean, he was backing Richie Valens at the El Monte Legion Stadium in the summer of 1958, before Richie died in that plane crash.
That brings me to a song I've been hearing, and I didn't know anything about it, Memories of El Monte. So what was El Monte? I thought it was a town, but I guess it's a stadium?
El Monte Legion Stadium was in the town of El Monte, and it had the benefit of being outside the city limits of Los Angeles, where it was illegal to hold rock and roll dances. So disc jockey named Art LeBeau mapped out the El Monte Legion Stadium as a place to throw rock and roll dances. And as it happened, El Monte was very much of a Latin neighborhood. So the dances drew from the immediate neighborhood, and there was a very mixed crowd there. And every weekend, they had a lineup of the latest and greatest people on the radio, backed by live musicians, do 2 or 3 songs, and they became famous for radio advertisements. Real shouty, echoey radio advertisements. This weekend at El Monte Legion Stadium, and the tagline was always, this weekend at El Monte Legion Stadium, no Levi's or Capris, please be there or be square.
It's just like the drag race commercials.
yeah, that was the genre of commercials. But yeah, El Monte Legion Stadium lasted until about like 63, and then that record that you're talking about that Frank Zappa wrote, Memories of El Monte. That was sort of like an early cashing in on rock nostalgia, where it's like a medley of all the old 50s doo-wop groups. The Cadillacs will sing, da-da-da, and they do a little bit of it.
5 seconds in the still of the night, and I'll dance and hold you tight.
Yeah.
And Frank Zappa.
Yeah, that's a cute record.
Frank Zappa, just to diverge, I had years ago his Reuben and the Jets album, which I really thought was really cute. I love that record.
So one of the things about this whole Los Angeles, this West Coast pop sound that I'm trying to describe the origins of in Hollywood Eden, is that it was really soundly based in what we've come to call doo-wop music, the street corner vocal sound that was very much part of the pre-rock and roll R&B scene. And you look at the English rock and roll of the Beatles and Rolling Stones, stuff like that, it's more substantively influenced and drawn from the Chicago-based blues and rhythm and blues and rock and roll records. This stuff in Los Angeles, it really drew from this this New York street corner sound. Not just the early records by Jan and Dean and a lot of the others, subsequent Los Angeles folk groups, Hollywood Argyles and Alley Oop and stuff like that, but early Beach Boys records. In fact, the whole Beach Boys thing is sort of shot through with what you would think of as kind of doo-wop-ish harmonies, although Brian tended to do more the Four Freshmen approach to it than the street corner thing. But the Jan and Deans were always kind of doo-woppy, and Zappa was like the last major rock artist to really use doo-wop in his music, and it was an element, a component of his music always, the pieces of that sound.
I have to go back to Jan and Dean for a moment. I used to have a record again, a double LP, and it had like Jan and his girlfriend at the time, and his car and at the time, and then would have Dean with his girlfriend and his car, and then the next page they'd switch girlfriends. So there you go. That chart was one of Dean's little conceits. Once your partner has been brain damaged, you're pretty much in charge of the history of the group. So Phil Spector, we've talked about Dick Dale. We got to talk about, of course, the Beach Boys. Can't talk about Southern California without the Beach Boys. And they started out in the neighborhood. David Marks was a guitar player for a while, but it was Murray Wilson really that kind of a harsh taskmaster and browbeat Brian to death almost?
Oh yeah, Murray was a horrible guy, and the entire family situation was terrible. The mother was a closet alcoholic, and it was just an awful situation, and certainly the roots of Brian's adult mental illness are in his upbringing without any question. The thing about the Beach Boys is that they come out of this lower middle class aesthetic that was so much a part of the fluid culture of Southern California. You didn't have to be born rich to think you could do anything, and the world was wide open to even somebody growing up in Hawthorne, which was how to explain Hawthorne? It's a flat, single-family homes, all built after the war on the GI Bill. Really, a lot of factory workers and people who couldn't afford to buy those homes today. But back in 1945, 46, out of the Army, there you go. Here's a $15,000 home you're in. You've got your family, and that's what the kind of neighborhood Hawthorne is. And yeah, it was such a small-time enterprise in the beginning that when Brian's friend Al decided to go to dental school rather than continue to be in the group, they just got the kid from across the street, really, literally, across the street. He was 13, but that's how David Marks joined the group. And, when Al came back from dental school, they were both in the group for a while, although Murray had his problems with David Marks and David Marks' parents. So that was not long for this world. Al's still in the group to this day. Well, he's still with us. He'll be in the reunion.
There'll be
David Marks will probably be in the reunion too. They brought him back in for the last reunion.
That's what I've heard. Summer of Love we've talked about. Not really. So yeah, the Summer of Love, you made a mention of that in one of your earlier books. It didn't quite turn out the way we all hoped it would, right?
What has?
Especially my career.
Well, Summer of Love was like 1994, I think, was when I published Summer of Love,
yeah.
And it was sort of the beginning of my dealing with ensemble narratives, where there isn't like one single person but Summer of Love has like with all the members of all the groups, something like 70 main characters in it. Oh. And it's a hodgepodge, to be sure. But it was my first effort in that. And then when I did the book, Here Comes the Night, which is ostensibly a biography of songwriter Burt Burns, it really is, again, it's much more of this ensemble portrait of the New York rhythm and blues world of 1960 to 65. So it was out of that book that my desire to do this book that became Hollywood Eden grew. Is I realized that there was an origin story in Los Angeles that could best be told in this kind of ensemble fashion rather than do a Jan and Dean biography or a Brian and Wilson and Beach Boys book. God knows those have been done.
Right.
But to take it apart and put it back together in this kind of community vision, because that's how culture is made. Culture is made by communities. And that made a lot of sense. And then, the trigger or the ignition point was seeing that University High yearbook and realizing that it was all for real.
And another weird thing about University High that you mentioned in Hollywood Eden, and we're talking with Joel Selvin. Hollywood Eden is the latest book. The kidnapping of Frank Sinatra Jr. was by a guy who went to University High. So how weird.
Yeah, well, I don't know how Dean got avoided being arrested on that. He was so involved in it.
Oh, yeah.
He financed it a couple of times. He had a safe deposit box that he shared with the mastermind of the kidnapping. Mastermind. It was the most bungled kidnapping in history of kidnapping. But the fact is that, he even lied about his involvement the first time he testified in court. He had to come back and go, no, I really didn't tell the truth the If this had happened in any time today, he would have been arrested as a co-conspirator along with all these other people that actually had their hands on Frank Jr. But yeah, it was a university high production. You know, Joe Amsler was one of the barons. So was Barry Keenan, who was the guy that thought this all up.
I thought it would be a great idea to, kidnap the son of the reigning king of swing. University High, Hollywood Eden, Joel Selvin. Your books, we can find out more about you at www.joelselvin.com. That's JOELSELVIN. Back to Joel now. Is there anybody in the music business who isn't a crook?
Oh, yeah. A lot of people get into the music business because of their bliss and because of their desire to be a part of that activity in those events. And they don't even think about it in terms of economic rewards. And those people are instantly preyed upon by people who are there for the economic rewards. You got to understand the era we're talking about. The music business was a real sort of small-time grift. There wasn't a huge money operation like, say, the movie business. You were selling small records with big holes in the center to kids,
right.
And at 69 cents to $1 a piece. Now there was real money in it, but not so much that like the big corporations felt like applying Procter and Gamble type marketing methods to this. That would come later in the 70s and 80s. But in the 50s and 60s, the people who were running the music business were either like dreamers and visionaries, or crooks and extortionists, and those that was where the business was at.
Well, you mentioned lots of, I'll call them shady deals in the book about somebody would record a song and then pay somebody $100, and then they take that song, put a different name on it, and sell it to somebody else for $1,000. I mean, it's just kind of seems shady all the way through. Even guys like Herb Alpert seem to do that kind of stuff.
So at this point, this industry is open on the ground floor, and people can walk in off the streets like Herb Alpert and get a place at the table, like Jan and Dean, like Phil Spector, like the Beach Boys. The ground floor is open. Now, when the ground floor is open, that means that like there's all kinds of factors operating. It's right on the street, isn't it? So yep. the level of the enterprise has not been elevated at all. That starts to happen over the course of Hollywood Eden, right?
Right.
I mean, you see like Lou Adler graduate from the storefront record companies to a Beverly Hills office with some sort of well-established show business partners, and they're going to like move forward on the record production, music publishing, talent management kind of level, more in tune with old type show business standards. But before that, Adler's been dealing with either R&B guys or hustlers with little independent labels, and trying to make his way through the Los Angeles record business, such as it was at that time, because it was very small.
And it sounds like, from what you write in Hollywood Eden, that you could start a record company like with $50 or something. Just say, "Hi, I'm Joel and Dennis. We got a record company called JD Sound. Sign here."
They're independent distributors carrying most of the labels that produce rock and roll records. And you could walk in there with a stack of records, and if you could get it on the radio, they'd get them in the stores, and you could sell them. Whether you could get paid for them or not really depended on whether the distributor believed you'd ever have another one for them or not. You know what I mean?
Right.
So it was a very fluid business, and the established record companies didn't understand this rock and roll. It was a ground up phenomenon, and they weren't really in a position to like swing into action, because their aesthetics, their standards, their training had all been based in entirely different realm, and suddenly this stuff is selling. Like by 1959, I think like independent labels were responsible for like 60% of the chart records, and 10 years before they were responsible for like 20%. And the independent labels were the ones that were run by these like street corner type guys that could deal with the teenagers that made the music, they were flexible and close to the ground enough to be able to see what was going on and adapt to it, whether you're talking about a relatively crusty old-time record guy like Al Bennett at Liberty Records, or a kind of out-of-it guy like Herb Newman at Era Records. Those guys were running these independent labels in Los Angeles that were putting out some of these records, and they were guessing as to what they were doing. I mean, at Liberty Records, they made their bones in 1959 with Witch Doctor by David Seville, which was, just the stupidest sort of novelty record ever, but boy, did it sell.
Yeah.
And there's no guiding aesthetic, behind, like there was, say, with Chicago's blues label, Chess Records, or the New York R&B label, Atlantic, where people behind the record company were actually had some idea about what they wanted to do with music. These guys were just guessing at what would be a hit record and trying to grab them when they found them.
There's so much more we could talk about. Hollywood Eden by Joel Selvin. It's out right now. I recommend you get it. What's your next project?
Oh, I've got several pots boiling on the stove. I'm not sure which one, I'm going to pull off and cook. But these take a long time. I really didn't start Hollywood Eden, until 2014, and so where are we now? Like it's 7 years later. Yeah. So these things are, they don't happen overnight.
No.
And the other thing about Hollywood Eden is that I really worked hard at trying to pull the women's stories out of the background and put it in the foreground, especially in regards to Jill Gibson, who's commonly mentioned in passing as Jan Berry's girlfriend. Jill Gibson was much more than somebody's girlfriend, and her whole story in the foreground of Hollywood Eden kind of parallels the whole generation of California girls that she was in. The struggle for identity as other than somebody's girlfriend, some kind of search for relevance and independence and purchase. And you can see her go through that all the way till the final end of the book. And likewise, Nancy Sinatra. I do not understand how an artist of Nancy Sinatra's stature, with a record as important as that, can be missing from all the accounts of rock and roll history. But she is. Maybe that's because most of the people writing those histories are men. I don't know. But that record is emblematic of her own personal search for some kind of identity that she could live in with authentically. And at the same time, it parallels her whole generation of women and the struggle that they went through. And that song, which cast a whole new role of self-assertion for females in pop music, really was a turning point in that whole kind of thinking. So that was another important part of Hollywood Eden, because, you can read about this stuff in a lot of books, but there's no sense that there were any women there at the time. And I assure you, women were there.
Exactly. And on that note, Joel Selvin, we have to wrap it up. Hollywood Eden by Joel Selvin. I highly recommend it. And I thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for your interest. As the book means a lot to me, and I'm glad to be able to talk about it with you.
Thank you for visiting with us today. This is Talking Books and Stuff with Dennis Rimmer. Contact him at dennis@talkingbooks.tk. Thank you, and may all the good news be yours. Oh, and don't forget to check out his book, The Great Canadian Notebook, available across Canada and at amazon.ca.